On the 26th of July 2023, the military head in Niger took over power by overthrowing the civilian president, Mohamed Bazoum. Just a week after that, on the 30th of July, the military junta in hundreds and their supporters in Niger set fire on the entrance of the French embassy and also burnt the French flags across the country. It was at this point that the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, ordered the evacuation of over 600 French nationals living in Niger. It was at this point that the world started to react to what was going on in Niger. A lot of people saying that this is definitely not just anti-democracy, but also anti-French, and not far from the truth. But the Niger indigents who support the military juntas came out in their hundreds of numbers, and in defense of their military, some said in an interview that France and its French people have been the major problem and setback they've had as Niger nationals since the beginning of Niger, that they have never been truly free from France even after the said independence in 1960, an independence which only existed on papers, that the French people have enslaved them ever since then in a modern colonization hiding under the umbrella of helping its formerly colonized country, Niger. The reason for this anger towards France lies in the history of West Africa and how French colonized the West African countries in the late 19th centuries. Niger became independent after the Second World War, but unlike other colonizers who left the country after independence, France never left. The influence of France and the presence continued to linger until recently when the coup set out to force France out of Niger. Why did the influence of France in Niger linger that much? Well, let's take a look at a bit of the background history of how France colonized Niger. From the early 16th century was when France became interested in Africa. Reason being because of slavery. The French were the third biggest slave traders in the world as at that time. At that point in time, the French slave trade masters took over 1.3 million Africans to their colony. Over 200,000 people perished at the sea on their way back to France. The French interest in Africa continued to grow, and it was a normal thing for them to come to Africa and pack slaves after the first attempt. For a very long time, the French people continued to enslave Africans. The initial French colonization in Africa began in modern-day Senegal, Madagascar, and along the Mascarene Islands. Based on the economy of the French people then, which were based on monoculture agriculture and forced African labor, poor living conditions, famine, and disease made enslaved labor conditions particularly lethal across French colonies. The presence of French in Senegal first began in 1626. Later, they were very well established after the founding of Saint Louis in 1659. The French West African was a confederation of 8 other French colonial territories, including French Mauritania, French Senegal, French Guinea, French Ivory Coast, French Upper Volta, French Dahomey, French Togoland, French Sudan, and French Niger. Having colonized the whole West Africa, the French saw that Africa was quite a gold mine, and since it needed food and natural resources from Africa for its fast-growing population in France, it was only right, as they thought, to dominate the African people and continue to take their wealth and natural resources. Because in Africa, there is gold, there is oil, there is food, among much other things. Africa became a new theater for the British, French, and America, who were already competing on slave mastering. Then in 1854, General Louis Faidherbe appointed the Senegal governor, where the West African slavery began. Immediately after his appointment, French controlled all the 8 West African countries I mentioned earlier, and that includes Niger, and started the extortion since then in 1854 till recently, when the Niger coup began. Almost all the resources French used in developing their countries are resources from Africa. The ambition of the French appointed president Louis Fadabe were bigger. The European slave masters practically shared and colonized all African countries among themselves. In the 1880s, 80% of African countries were still being ruled by the local rulers of Africa, kings, chiefs, sultans, and others. But in the 19th, all that changed by the white colonies, and these white colonies and the European rulers took up to 90% of African countries, including Niger, and this was ruled by the French rulers. The major French rulers then were Captain Paul Vaut and Julien Canoin. Their mission was simple: get the locally enlightened Africans, convince them, and basically build a French territory that will stand strong forever. And that was what they did, and involved almost all the African countries. These two French leaders led a lot of the conquest in Africa, including the French conquest of Burkina Faso in 1896. The ruler Captain Paul Vaut was brutal and mean to Africans. He was ready to destroy anyone who opposed him. He led the heart of darkness, the African apocalypse. A lot went down then, and that was one of the most deadliest episodes of colonial histories in the entire world. Anywhere Paul Vaut doesn't get his way in Africa, then he wipes out the whole people entirely. He also never fed his camp members, and if they complain, they are gone. When Paris got to know about what Paul Vaut was doing then in Africa, him and his colleague were both arrested, and that was their end. They were ended by their own soldier. The slave mission continued in Africa, especially West Africa. It was after the end of Paul Vaut that the French troops came in mass and took over Africa. They had different territories. They were also using rebellion force on the people, even though not like that of Paul Vaut. They were initially opposed by the Africans, but the Africans couldn't do much because they had no enough war gadgets. France crashed all the Africans' rebellions and took over. Then came the First World War, where around 2.5 million Africans were part of the war, and they fought for France. They were practically used as France's subjects. And at this point, they never had freedom because they were still subjects to France. In the Second World War, around 1 million Africans also served for France in 1946. The Africans being the subject to France, slave masters changed after the Second World War because at this point, a lot of Africans were more aware and wanted freedom. In 1946, Niger and other French colonized African countries became an overseas French territory, and they got sitting parliaments. Then with elections came political parties, and the most important one in the history of Niger was the Progressive Party of Niger, PPN. The main contestants of Niger then were Djibo Bakri and Hamani Diori. They were cousins and also rivals. After that, an important moment in Niger came in 1958. France opted a new constitution and wanted its colony to vote on it. Like a referendum, if Niger passed it, the country will remain in the French community. The party leading candidates both chose different paths. Djibo Bakri called for the boycott, which let's vote yes, as he was not ready for independence at that time. He wanted more autonomous community with the French people, and he prevailed. In 1958, about 72% of Niger's population voted yes, and Djibo Bakri became the new president of Niger. As they continued, the pressure from the Niger people for independence continues to grow, especially in the North Desert. Then in 1960, the French people had to give in and grant Niger independence. The Djibo was then elected president again, and then he banned all other democratic parties in Niger. He controlled everything and ruled like an autocrat, not democracy. At this point, the story of Niger and France colonization should have ended because it's assumed that Niger is now independent. But unfortunately, this was just the beginning. France never left like every other colonizer. France remained in Niger, built their military bases. France also became the ones mining 90% of the Niger uranium. They were also in control of producing Niger's currency and a lot of other things they controlled, up until the coup that happened on July 26, 2023. So they took over everything and they were giving the Niger people peanuts and using lots of Niger resources to continue developing their developed country already. But it is 21st century, and of course, the Niger people are wise and they now know that these people have been enslaving them and are the major problem because they've also contributed to insecurity in Niger, as the military junta had accused them of sponsoring and providing ammunition for some military group that have terrorized Niger. If you've watched to this extent, this is just the summary of why Franks do not want to leave Niger. And this is the history behind French colonization in Niger and the entire West Africa. Don't forget that this is Connect Media, where we bring you daily news at its finest. Please, if you like this video, like it, subscribe to this channel if you haven't, turn on your bell notification so you get notified the next time we upload another amazing video. Don't forget to follow us across social media at Connect Media 247. Thank you for watching. Please have a nice day.